In this part 2 of HTML Fundamentals, we dive deeper into the world of coding. From structuring your content with tags to styling elements with CSS, we'll cover it all. If you missed part 1, don't worry. Check the link in the description and cards below. Let's jump right in and level up your HTML skills.
One of the fundamental building blocks of the internet are hyperlinks, or for short, just links. So links are what actually enables the internet to be a World Wide Web. So without links between pages, there would be no web. And so let's now learn how to place links on our own web pages. Now we can place links into two big categories. The first category is links that point to other pages within our own website. So let's say that here in our website, the Code Magazine, we had another blog post. So we could then create a link from this page to that other page, right? Now, on the other hand, the other category is links that point to outside of our website. So for example, if I placed a link to udemy.com here on this page, then that of course would be a link to the outside of our website, right? Now we do create these two types of links in the exact same way in HTML, but there's still some kinds of particularities that we need to be aware of. And so let's now actually start with the second kind of link that I was describing, which point outwards of our own website. So what I have here in the demo is that here at the end of this part, so of this What is HTML section, I have a link to the MDN web docs. So this is basically a website where you can learn all about HTML and also CSS and JavaScript. And actually, I will show you this site a little bit better in the next section, because it's important as a web developer to know how to use and find information here in this web documentations page. So what we want is to grab the link of that. And so to do that, just Google MDN, which stands for Mozilla Developer Network, and then just HTML. And the exact URL that we're going to use here doesn't really matter. All we want is to have some URL that points outside of our own page, right? So let's just grab this one here, which was the first Google result. So I'm copying it. And again, keep in mind that this is called a URL. So as you know, every single website on the internet has its own URL. And so that is what we need in order to create a link to that page. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, we want to put that right here after this unordered list, right? Let's see in the demo. Yeah, so right here after the ordered list. So that's here. So to create a link in HTML, we use the A element, which stands for anchor. So technically, a hyperlink or a link is actually called anchor in HTML. So it is an anchor element. We can close it. Then we can specify some content, and then we have to actually close it. So let's start by doing that. Now, as for the content of the link, what we specify here is actually the text that we want to be displayed on the page. So the text of the link. So in this case, that is this MDN web docs. All right, so MDN web docs. But now, what about the URL where we want this link to point to? Well, for that, we need to once again use an attribute. So in this case, it is the href attribute. Then equal, double quotes, and then we can simply paste that URL that we copied right here. And that's actually it. So if I give it a save now, and then reload our page here, then here is our link. And you see it down there, so here in this corner, that when I hover it, it actually shows me the URL, and then when I click it, our page goes there. Great. And so that is actually already the basics of creating a link. Very simple, right? Now we want this link here to actually be like inside of this text. So inside of one more paragraph here, right? So let's create that paragraph. So you can learn more at. And then this link here is basically just a continuation of the text in here. So inside of this paragraph. So we can finish our sentence here and then close up our paragraph as usual. And so now that looks just like in the original one, right? Now notice what happens here once again when I click it. So you see that we navigated directly to this page and now our own page disappeared. So of course we can go back here, but sometimes what we want to do is to open a link in a new tab. So let me also show you how we can do that. And of course we don't always want that. So many times we actually want the page to really move to the URL that we specified here, but also sometimes it's useful to keep the page open and simply open the URL in a new tab. And we can do that by specifying the target attribute, then the quotes as always, and then this one looks a bit weird. So it's underscore and then blank. So give that a save. And when we reload, it will look the same, but the behavior should have changed. And indeed, notice how it opened a new tab and our original one is still open. Great. So that worked. And so we have now a link that points to a URL that is outside of our own website. But now about that first scenario where we want to link to an internal page, basically. Let's do that now. And going back again to our demo, we have here this example. So in the very beginning, right after the main heading, we have these links here. And so these are supposed to be links that point to pages that are part of this blog. So let's now create this first link here, so blog, and also create a new page where we can actually link to. Okay, and so creating a new page is as simple as creating a new HTML document. So let's open up again our sidebar by clicking here. And then we see our Explorer here basically with all the files. And then again, we create a new file in this icon here. And let's call it blog.html this time. And now we could use this cheat here to create the HTML structure. But actually, let's practice a little bit here again. And if you want, you can even pause the video and type it out on your own. But I will just do it here very fast now. So HTML, then we need to close it, of course. Now inside of the HTML, remember we have the head. Inside of the head, we have a title usually. And this one, let's just call it like this, blog. So just uppercase to make it really obvious. And you see that this is really just a very bare bones structure, just a head with a title. And actually the same for the body, which remember is the part that is going to be visible in the browser. So here I will simply specify an h2 element and close it also here. And let's call this one blog as well. Okay, we still need to close the body, of course. And that's it. Let's give it a save. And so here we have a very simple, very bare bones block HTML document. But now with that in place, we can create a hyperlink or a link right here in this index.html, which will point to that blog.html. And so the browser will then navigate to that page. So let's do it right here after the h1. And so the anchor element. Then we need the href. And so now what we do here, instead of specifying a URL, is to specify the name of the HTML file that we want to go to. And so in this case, it is of course this blog.html that we just created. Then here, as the content of the element, let's just write blog again, and then close it as always. Give it a save. Here is our beautiful link. And now watch what happens as I click it. Bam, we are now at blog. And you can see that also here in the URL bar, so which is now all of this file, and so all of this path, and then at the end, blog.html, right? Now to go back, we could of course click here on this back button, but what we could also do is to add a link here, which simply points back to index.html, right? That sounds like a nice idea, doesn't it? So let's come back here to blog.html, and as yet another challenge, now I want you to actually create this link on your own. So pause the video here and create a link that points back to index.html. So, did you manage to do that? Or at least try it? Well, I sure hope so. But anyway, of course we use the A element again, then we specify href, and well, to go back, we just say index.html. And then here we can specify any text, which I didn't tell you which one, because it doesn't really matter. Let's just say back to home or something like that. Give it a save. And now once we reload it, we have our link, we can click it. And so now we can basically go back and forth between these two pages because they're now connected through these links. So we can go to the blog, we can go back and forth, and so on and so forth. All right, so let's close up this one here. We don't need it anymore. And just to finish, we can also actually specify a link that doesn't go anywhere. So let me show that to you as well. So let's just write the content first. And here I have challenges, I think, in the demo. So we have challenges, flexbox, and CSS grid. So that's challenges. But watch what happens now when I reload the page like this. So you see that it only says challenges, but notice how it's just normal text. It's not blue and not underlined, so it's clearly not a link, right? So even though it is actually an anchor element. But what makes an anchor element really a link is the href property. And so we really need to specify it. Otherwise, it is not a link at all. It is then just an anchor, which is not really useful. Now, but what if we don't want this to point anywhere, as I was saying? Well, the solution to that is to specify this hash symbol right here, right? So if I now save it and reload, then we are back to this being a link, actually. It just doesn't point anywhere. What happens when you click on this link is that basically it goes back to the top of this current page, okay? And a little bit later in the course, we will actually make use of this behavior. But for now, I just want you to know that this is how we can specify links when we don't have any URL yet for them or don't have any page. So basically, this is like a placeholder link. Okay, and so let's just copy this here twice. There's no need to write it again. But of course, if you want, you can write it again. So just for this flexbox and CSS grid. So just to make that navigation look a bit more like complete. But all of these links, they should not point anywhere. Okay, and this is how you specify links or hyperlinks or anchors, as we can also call them, in HTML. So this is a really important part of the web, as I said in the very beginning. And so make sure that you understand how they work and how we place them inside our own web pages. So we already learned a couple of very important HTML elements and are already able to create a nice page with some nice functionality as well. But now it's time to actually add some structure to our document and to our elements. And so let's now learn a couple of new HTML5 elements for that. Now, when I said that the page is lacking some structure, what I meant is that all of these elements that we placed in our document, they're all simply like appearing one after another here, right? They're not really like distinguished from one another, and especially they're not like grouped together in any logical way. And so let's change that by creating some container elements which will then group these elements together. So one of the things that first come to mind is these links here. So we have all of these links, and this kind of looks like a page navigation here, right? So a page navigation is usually what we want when we have a couple of links at the top of a page. And so what we can do is to specify a special element and then place all the links into that element. And the element that I mean is called nav. So nav, which stands for navigation. So just like this. And now these need to be indentated, or they should be at least. And so when I give it a save, then Prettier formats this automatically. And now these 4 links are nicely grouped into this container here. So into this parent element, which is a navigation. Now, the thing is that when we now update our page, it does look exactly the same. So all that happens here is that this basically created like an invisible box, which now contains these elements. Okay, so the element on itself doesn't do anything. All it does is to group these elements together. And I understand that right now it doesn't really seem intuitive or logical to be doing this, but trust me, once we reach the section where we build some layouts, and actually also in the next section just on CSS, it will be very important to have all these different parts inside of their own containers. All right. So looking at our page, basically this is now the navigation, and this here is the heading. Then after that, we have all of this here, which is basically our post, so our blog post, right? So this is kind of different than this top part. So all of this is the blog post again, and this is like the top part of our web page. So what we can do is to group this navigation and the heading into a header element. All right, so let's do that. So this is another HTML5 element, which is called header. And the header basically means the top part of a web document, or it can also mean the top part of some smaller unit, as we will actually see in a minute. And anyway, this is just an introduction to these HTML5 elements. We will use them even more, and I will explain them even more when we build our big website project a little bit later in this course. Okay, so again, nothing will have changed visually, but now we told the browser, like, hey, all of this here is our web page header. So it's the top part of our page. Then all of this, as I mentioned before, starting here, is the main part of the page, which is in this case a blog post. And a very common element that we can use for a blog post is the article element. So this is yet another container element, but this time it's one for an article. An article in this context actually does not simply mean a written article like this, but it can also be like things from the real world. Like a computer is an article, or a pen, or a phone. So all of these are articles, and if somehow we needed to represent a computer in HTML, then an article would also be a good element for that. Okay, and so now basically our body has only 2 direct child elements. We only have a header and we have an article, which is, when we look at our page, really all we have. So we have the header and we have all of the rest, which is our article. So that is now nicely placed inside of its own box. Now, one thing that you might ask, well, if these boxes, all of them don't do anything, then why don't we call all of them just nav, or all of them header, or all of them article? So this one could also be article and nothing would change on the page, right? However, we don't do that for something called Semantic HTML, and I will explain briefly what that means in the next video. But now, continuing even further, we can actually do some more grouping here inside of our article. So notice how we have kind of this top part here of the article. So basically the heading, the author here, and also the image. So this is kind of the top part of our article. And then here we have the content itself, right? And so once again, notice how I said that this is like the top part of the article. So just like this here is the top part of the entire web page. So what that means is that here again, we should use a header element to basically mark that up. And by marking up, I mean to basically describe the content in a better way. So as I just said, inside of the article, we want to also have a header. So inside of that header, there should be this heading, this author image, the author name, and then here, this image. Okay, and then closing it. Now, all of this is, of course, a little bit subjective as well. So what seems very logical here to me might not be as logical for other developers. But I think that what we just did here up until this point is quite logical for everyone and makes sense. So again, this one here is the header part of the article. And with this, we gave our article a little bit more structure. So we have the header, and only after that, then comes the rest of the content. Okay, so this is looking quite nice already. But finally, if we look at our demo here, there's actually one thing missing. And in fact, there's multiple things. So we don't have these related posts yet, but we will take care of that later. But we also have this part here at the bottom. So it's this copyright notice here. And this kind of content that comes at the very end of a page is what we usually call the footer. And so there's actually, as you might have guessed, a special element for that as well in HTML5. So footer, and then let's close it also like this. And now let's grab actually the text from here. Actually, it's not here. So we have to just write it manually. And now here we have two options. So to write this text, we could create a paragraph and then put that text in there. Or we could actually also write the text right here into this footer. Okay. And this is, in fact, what I will do now. So in this case, there is just no need here to create yet another paragraph because it's going to be the only child of this footer element here anyway. And so there's no need then. So copyright. And now here you see this copyright symbol, which I'm sure you know. So how do we create that? Well, this is something called an HTML entity. So actually this is something new. So let me show you quickly how we do that. So we write an ampersand like this. And then in this case, I already know the name of the character that I want. So I can just start writing copy. And so then I can select this one here, or I can just write the semicolon, and then we're done. So this HTML entity here is what represents this C here. Okay. And there are entire tables for HTML entities. And I have one on my resources page. I think I haven't mentioned that resources page yet, but there is a link to it in the very first text lecture in the first section, and also in the GitHub repository that I showed you in one of the first lectures. And there you will find a link to a page which contains all of these HTML entities. But anyway, we will talk a little bit more about this later in the course anyway. The code magazine. Okay, so written in the future. Give it a save, and once again, let's reload. And as we were expecting, the visual aspect of the page is still the same as I mentioned at the beginning. So these again are just important to group the content into logical parts, which is important for semantic HTML and also for styling with CSS, as you will see in the next section. And speaking of semantic HTML, that is going to be the topic of our next video. So I hope to see you there very soon. So I mentioned the term semantic HTML a couple of times in this section. And so let's now actually very quickly define what I actually mean by semantic HTML. So in HTML, when we talk about semantics, what we mean is that certain elements have actually a meaning or a purpose attached to them. So when we think about a certain HTML element, we should actually not think about what that element looks like as it's rendered on the page, but instead we should think about what that element actually means and what it stands for. So that is basically the definition of semantic HTML. Now, not all elements in HTML are semantic, and actually I talked a little bit about that before here in this element. So the strong element, which makes our element look bold here on the page. So remember how previously I used the B element, which simply turns its content bold, but doesn't attach it any meaning, right? So I explained that before, and so now maybe it makes a bit more sense. So again, by using the strong element here, the text will still look bold here in the browser, but what really matters here is that we now assign some meaning to this content here. We now say that it's a strong content, which means basically a very important piece of content. And the same here for this piece. So this fundamental word here. So again, we use em for emphasizing this. And so it still looks italic here on the web page, but what we really mean is that we emphasized this word here. So we gave it a special emphasis, and yeah, that's what this element here right now means. Okay? And the same is actually true for all of these elements that we used in the last video. So for example here, this navigation element. All this does is to create a box, remember, which then contains these 4 anchor elements, but visually it doesn't really do anything. All this does is to represent as a meaning that this is a navigation. But instead of using nav, we could also have used a more generic element, which is the div element. So for example, div, open and close it here. And again, visually, nothing will change. And so all this did was to create a new box, but a box without any meaning. So that's what div stands for. So back in the day, before HTML5, we always used divs for every single box that we needed like this on the page. But then HTML5 came around and introduced this concept of semantic HTML. And so now we should only use the div element when we don't want to attach a certain meaning to a certain container. So to a certain like box element on our page. So in this case, we really want this to mean that it's a navigation. And so we use the navigation element for that. Okay, and the same is true for the article, the header, the footer that we have down here. And in fact, it is true even for the paragraph, for example. Because all that this paragraph here and all the other paragraphs really are essentially boxes filled with text. Now the P, of course, does have a semantic meaning. It means that it is a paragraph, but we could, again, use a generic box without any meaning, so this div, and nothing would change visually. Okay, actually something did change here, so we lost some of the white space that we do have around the P. All right, so let's put it back here anyway to the P, because we want it to have some meaning. And of course, we also want the spacing that the browser gives us by default around the P elements. Okay, but the idea that I mentioned still holds, because we could very easily recreate this space here using some CSS later. So if we wanted, we could in fact build the entire web page only out of div elements if we wanted, and then use CSS to style them as we want. But of course, we don't do that. We use semantic HTML to give our elements meaning. Now, you might ask why we actually do that, and there are multiple reasons. And I think I mentioned them already, actually. So one of them is search engine optimization, which basically means that search engines such as Google will be able to understand the structure of your content, and therefore they will be better able to analyze what your content and what your web page is all about. Also, writing semantic HTML is extremely important for accessibility, and especially for people who rely on screen readers to consume our web pages. Okay, so I hope that this makes sense, and we will also keep touching on this subject as we go through the rest of the course. But I still wanted to make it very clear from the very beginning that when we think about HTML, we should not only think about how it actually looks like in the browser, but even more about what these elements actually mean and what they stand for. And with that being said, we kind of finished all we had to learn in this section. And so in the next video, we will configure VS Code a little bit more, and then we will move on to 2 final challenges in this section. So don't wait, and let's move on to the next lecture here. Welcome back. So we started configuring our VS Code editor in the very beginning of the course, but now at this point we are ready to install 3 additional extensions that will make our lives a little bit easier as we code HTML and CSS. And so let's head over to our extensions panel here. And the first extension that I want to install here is called Image Preview. So it's this one, and I already have it installed. So I just need to click on Enable. Okay, so that's the first one. And what this one is going to do is that here in our HTML, it now displays the small image preview here in this gutter, as it's called. So here we have this one, and then this image here is also right here where we declare it, so where we include it in our code. And this can be extremely helpful sometimes. So that's why I really wanted to show you this one. The next one that I want to show you is called Color Highlighter or Highlight. So it's this one here. And again, I already have it installed. I just enable it. And actually this one I cannot show you yet what it looks like because it will only be relevant in CSS. But trust me that this extension is really, really helpful for visualizing colors in CSS. Next up is an extension called Auto Rename Tag. So this one, and you see it's an extremely popular one once again. So you have to download it and enable it. And then what happens here is that when we change the name of an element, let's say we actually wanted to make this one a div, then you see it automatically also changes the closing one. So the closing tag. Okay. And this again is extremely helpful and makes our life writing HTML a bit easier, because trust me, we need to do this all the time, like changing the element name. Okay. Now, another thing that we need to do, or at least that we can do if we want, is to go back to our settings and then turn back on this setting that we deactivated at the beginning of this section. So that's the auto, let's spell that right. So auto close tag. So let's enable this back, because I think at this point you will no longer make the mistake of forgetting a closing tag. And so now we can allow VS Code to do that work for us. So for example, if we wanted to write a paragraph here, then now you see HTML automatically closed that element for us. Okay, but this we don't need. And now we are going to install the most important and the most useful one of all, and that is called Live Server. So it's this one here, Live Server, with almost 12 million downloads. And this one is popular for a reason. So I just click Enable here. And so when I go now to my HTML, and let's close this one down. So close down the sidebar. Now down here in this bar, we should have now this Go Live button. Okay, so hopefully after installing this Live Server extension, you can also see this button down here in this status bar. So when I now click this, then it's starting, and we get this message that server is started at this port number here. Let's close that. And you see that it opened a new tab which contains our page, right? So basically it looks exactly the same, but there is one very big difference. So let's say we want to change this here, and I'm going to call it Jonah's code. And now look closely what happens here as I save this file. So I hit Command S now, or Control S on Windows, and you see what happened? It automatically reloaded the page without us having to do anything. So all we did was save the code, and what will then happen is that this page here gets automatically updated. So all the changes that we did here will basically get injected into this page, and yeah, we can then see the reflection of our changes immediately. So I put it back now, hit again Command or Control S to save it, and immediately you see it going back to what it was before. Now, if we wanted to stop this connection once we are done developing, all we have to do is to click down here on this icon here where it says port 5500. And by the way, this port number is exactly what we have here. Okay, so just for the sake of curiosity, this one here means that it's a localhost server. So basically it's like you have now a web server on your own computer running, and then we have actually this code running at this port number. And so this port, it's basically like a sub address of your web server, so of the localhost server. But this doesn't really matter. What matters is that this now works, and it is really, really helpful for our development workflow. Now, if for some reason you could not make this work on your computer, then of course don't worry. So you can still do it the old way. So basically the way we have been doing it all along up until this point. So you can just open up the file from your file system like we did, and then keep refreshing it manually, right? But we right now no longer need this tab here because we now have our live connection. So we have our live server serving up this page here whenever we do some edits. All right, and with that, we are now ready to tackle our final last two coding challenges in this HTML fundamentals section. Now it's time for the first big coding challenge in this course. So let's get started. Now, before we start with the actual challenge, I want to first make some changes to the file structure that we have in this project right now. And in particular, what I want to do is to put all the images into one folder so that I can then show you how we can include the images like this when they are located in a specific folder. So right now, they are all, as we can see here, they're all in the exact same folder as the index.html. And so that's why all we have to do is to declare the name here, and the browser will then find them basically in the same folder as the HTML document. But now let's create a new folder by clicking this icon, and I'm going to call it img, and then I'm going to put all of the images there. So just dragging and dropping them like this. Okay. And so now if we reload the page, and not this one, which is our demo, but the one we're working on. And by the way, this time I had to actually manually reload the page because I had my computer turned off in the meantime. And so whenever you do that, the very first time you come back, you will have to manually reload the page here when you are running the live server extension. Okay, so remember that we installed that in the last video. And so if I do some change here now, then that should probably just work just before. So you see there's some change, and there it appeared. But anyway, you see that now that we have these images inside of the img folder, they are no longer found in the same folder as index.html. So that's why they don't appear up here. So what we need to do here is to change the path to the image now. And that's not a difficult problem. All we have to do is to start a new path with the name of the folder. So that's img and then /. And so here we go. So you see the image appears here now again in this gutter. And so let's do the same thing here. Give it a save. And here are our images back. Okay, so usually we always put the images in a separate folder. And so I thought that was important to show you, especially now before this challenge where we are going to use some more images. So about the challenge, I'm being here back in the demo page. And so essentially what I want you to do is to code on your own this part here. All right. And let me actually show you where that should be in our markup. So in our HTML. And it is right here after the article. Okay. So this section here about the related posts is no longer part of the article. It's also not part of the footer. And so here we will need another element. And this one I will actually write for you. So here we are going to use the aside element. And the aside element is usually used for some secondary information that complements the information in the main part of the page. So in this case, the main part of the page is the article, and then the aside, which is secondary information, is basically some related posts that are related to the article, so to the main part. Okay. Now visually, many times we use the aside element as a sidebar, but it doesn't have to be that way. Okay, but now about the challenge itself. So you see that it starts here with this heading. So you can experiment which heading is best here. So one of the headings, H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, remember. And then here you see that this is actually a list, right? You can see that because of these bullet points. And so here for this part, you should probably use a list. Now, what we didn't do before was to have multiple elements inside of one list item. So up here, for example, we have the list item, and in there, there's only some text. But you see that here in each item, there's an image, a link, and then some more text here. And that's no problem at all. So inside of each list element, there can be multiple other child elements, right? And so with that information, I think you are now able to build this. Now, finally, just about the images here, that's some more information that you need. They are also in this folder, and they are called related 1, 2, and 3. And the dimensions I want you to give them is 75 by 75 pixels. And now I think I gave you everything, so please pause the video now and take a couple of minutes, 10, 15 minutes maybe, to write up the HTML for this section. So good luck with that, and I see you once you're ready. All right. So hopefully you did this just fine. So let me show you how I did it. And I hope that you start to see how helpful it is that VS Code now automatically closes or HTML elements, right? So the source here is in the IMG folder, and then related 1. Then the alt text, let's just say that this is a person programming. And of course, your alt text doesn't have to be exactly the same as mine. So if your alt text is a bit different, that is not a problem at all. And now we need to close it as well. And so that's the image part. Next, we have a hyperlink, so an anchor tag. And here, the href, which is something that I didn't mention, but hopefully you figured it out, that this is one of the links that should not point anywhere for now. So how to learn web development. And now finally there's some text with the author there. And so we can use a paragraph for that. So by Jonas Schmettmann. Okay, giving it a save. Now it's nicely formatted and it should appear down here. And indeed, here it is. Great. Oh, I'm just missing here the heading actually. So let me go back and put that even before the unordered list. So I'm using an H4 for that. But anyway, let's continue now building our list here with the next list item. And by the way, if you did your code a little bit different from mine, that's really not a problem. What matters here is that you tried writing the code on your own. That is really the most important thing that I was expecting you to do here. So with 75, the height also 75. Then again, a link pointing nowhere. And this one is the unknown powers of CSS. And by Jim Dillon. And I'm not going to check out the result just yet. Let's just finish it. So another image. So the goal of this part here was really to have you practice writing this same code, basically, or very similar code over and over again, because this is the only way that this stuff really gets into your brain. So let's call this one JavaScript code on a screen. And again, the width of 75 and the height of 75. And you notice I'm writing this a little bit faster right now because we don't want to waste a lot of time writing this repetitive code. This was really just for you to practice. Is awesome. Finally, the paragraph. Give it a save. And beautiful. So this looks just like in our demo, and we have now all this content that we want to display here nicely marked up in a very logical way. So you might be wondering why we used a list here in this case. And the reason for that is basically the idea behind semantic HTML that I explained a little bit earlier. So if we think about these related posts, we can very easily argue that it is essentially a list of related posts, right? And so if it is a list, we should mark it up in our HTML. So we should write our HTML as a list. And so that's just what we did. Later with CSS, we will then remove these bullet points because they don't make a lot of sense in this context. But even with the bullet points removed, we still want the meaning of this element, so of all of this here, to be a list. But anyway, that's enough for this video. So I really hoped that you completed this challenge and that you enjoyed doing it, even if it took some time and even if you had to review some concepts from the previous lectures. That's completely normal, and that's exactly how it should be, actually. Now, in order to practice a little bit more even, there is another coding challenge coming up, which is completely detached from this project. But it's a really exciting one, so I hope to see you there soon. Time for another exciting coding challenge so that you can keep practicing your new HTML skills. And in this one, I want you to build this component for this Converse All-Star shoe. And I'm saying component here because I want you to imagine this content here in the context of something like an e-commerce store. So imagine that we have a shoe store and there are multiple shoes, and for each of them, there is then like the small component with this description. So stuff like the price, a short description, a link, and then some product details here. Now I am building this component, so I'm writing this HTML on a special coding platform called codepen.io. So this is a place online where we can basically write our code, and it will then automatically execute the code and render it, and it makes it also easy to share that code. Now, of course, you don't need to use CodePen in order to complete this challenge. You can just go to your code editor and, for example, add a brand new HTML file here, and then build all the code in there. The reason why I'm not doing that here in the video is because we're actually going to build on this challenge later. So we will keep developing this very small project over the next few sections, and that would then create a mess of different files and a lot of different code. But of course, because you're doing it on your own computer, it's easier for you. And so you can just, as I said, if you want, create a new HTML file and do it here. But on the other hand, I think it's also helpful and useful for you to learn a little bit about codepen.io and create the challenge there. So Let me just give you a very quick demonstration of CodePen. So just Google CodePen, I would say, or you can go to codepen.io. And then all you have to do is to click here on Start Coding. Now, maybe in the future, something has changed about CodePen, so about this interface, but you will always be able to create a new CodePen simply by going to codepen.io/pen. So just like this. So here we basically have a panel where we can write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript if we want, or we can also just collapse these panels if we don't need them, which is the case right now. And so here we can write our HTML. Let's just write an h1 element, hello world, for example. And you see that here we have to, again, manually close the element. But anyway, you see that after some time, it then renders the result down here. So in this results panel, basically. You can also change the name of your CodePen. So let's say challenge 2, which is the name of this lecture. Okay, and then you can also save it. Now to save it, you will have to create a free account, but I would say that it's actually worthwhile to do so. But of course, it's optional and you are not forced to create a new account here. But if you do, that is actually very helpful because then you will get a special URL for each CodePen, and then you can share that CodePen with others. So if you want to just like create a quick example, a quick demo of something to show it to someone, then you can just come to CodePen, create it right here, and then copy paste the URL from here once you have saved it. And by the way, what I just described is actually also the best way of sharing code in the Q&A section on Udemy in case you run into any problems. Okay, so again, it would probably be a good idea to create an account here because it's just useful and many programmers use CodePen. It's a very popular tool. But anyway, going back now to the challenge, let me give you a couple of hints. Okay, so this is what the result looks like that I want you to build. But to help you a little bit, I will actually need to change you a bit of the code. So here in Change View, we can now switch to the editor view, which will then look just like what I showed you before. All right, so now we have the editors here on top and then the result down here. So there are some things I need to explain before you can get started. So first of all, I want you to wrap all of this content inside an article element. And remember how I mentioned that an article element can not only be used for something like a written blog post article, but also for like really a physical article. And so a shoe like this is a perfect example for that. So this is an article, and again, coming back to the example of having like an e-commerce store, then each shoe would be a different article. And so you would have one article element for each of the shoes, right? Then down here, there is an element that we have never used, which is this clickable button. And so down here, you see that this is simply the button element. And so you can just go ahead and use that. And then finally, there's something else, which is this symbol here. So this arrow here. Now, remember how back in our project, so here, I mentioned that this symbol right here, this copyright symbol, is an HTML entity, right? Remember that? And so this arrow here is just another HTML entity. And I also mentioned back then that there is a very handy list on my resources page, which is this one. Now, if you're watching this in the future, then this page probably looks quite different. But for now, this is what I have. And the HTML entity reference that I mentioned earlier is this one. So let's just open it up actually. And then there is a lot of stuff that you can use. So all of these different symbols. And here, for example, is the copy symbol that we used before in VS Code. Now, this is a huge list, and I'm just going to use a Command or Control F to search on the page for arrows. And here we go. So there are all these different arrows here, and the one that I used is this. So to insert this arrow into your own HTML code, all you have to do is to write this HTML entity. Okay. And yeah, I will leave this. Oh, well, actually, we don't need it anymore. Right. Oh, and just one more thing, which is the image. So you cannot really upload images to CodePen unless you have a paid account, but that doesn't make sense, I think. And so I actually uploaded the image for you onto this URL. So you see that this is actually another way of including images. So essentially an image that is coming from a certain URL. So in contrast, right here, when we wrote our code before, then the source was always an image on our own computer. So in this case, in the image folder, and then this image name. And if you're building this challenge on your own computer, then you can just use this challenge image here. So it's exactly the same. Okay, but if you're building it on CodePen, like I'm going to do, then you will need this image that is located at this URL. So just copy this here somehow from the screen and use it for your own project. Then the dimensions of the image should be 250 by 250. And with this, I think I gave you everything that you need to know. So go ahead and copy this URL. And now I will switch to the full page view so that you can see everything at once. And now I will just leave you to it and come back here in 5 or 10 minutes once you are ready. Okay, here we are back, and I hope that it wasn't too much of a challenge for you, so that it wasn't too hard. So hopefully you got to practice your skills a little bit more. And so now, in case you have any doubt or you run into any problem, I will now show you my solution here. So as I mentioned, we are using an article here. And now for the heading, I used an H2, actually and not an H1, because of that idea of this being a component within a bigger page. Okay, and so each page should only have one H1. And so if we then have multiple articles, then each of them should just be an H2. So converse, Chuck, Taylor, all star. Well, I could have just copied this from the demo, but anyway. So IMG. And now I will actually go ahead and copy this URL here in the editor view. Okay. Then the alt text is, I'm just copying it now here. Oh, this should be enough like this. And then the height and the width at 250. And here it is. Here is our image. Great. Now let's go back here and actually copy all of this content. Why not? Then we can just, after that, wrap everything into its own element. So here we have the price, and I will keep using a paragraph for each of these elements, so for each of the text elements. Then we have free shipping. Okay, oh, and you see that CodePen actually automatically did some indentation there, so that's quite helpful. Then here there's another paragraph. Right. So we are getting our content formatted, except of course for all the content that is not inside any element. So remember how I mentioned that HTML doesn't care about any spacing or about any enters. So like line breaks, everything is just in the same line. And so that's why we need to structure our content in a logical way. Now here we have that anchor element. And actually, I didn't really tell you where this link should point to. So you could have just created an empty link like this, basically, or you could have linked the Converse website. So let me just grab that link. So converse.com, probably. And I'm doing it like this. You will see in a moment why. And the reason is because we actually need this HTTPS : so the entire URL. This is not necessary here. And now here, let's close this. And here, of course, we do not just want this symbol, because this is not really correct. So instead, we want that HTML entity that you hopefully used. So that is the right arrow. So this is the abbreviation here for R stands for right, and then R for arrow. And so indeed, this is the result that we got. Okay, so we have all of this part. Now let's take care of this list here and this heading. And finally, then also this button. So I have an H2 already up here, right? And so for this one, I'm using an H3 now. H3 and closing it. Nice. And now remember, in order to create a list, which is what we want here, so a bullet pointed list, we use the unordered element, or actually the unordered list element. And now we just wrap all of these into one li element, right? So I hope that at this point, you already know these elements. So you have practiced a lot, and so I'm sure that this is getting a lot more easy for you now. Let's just remove this dot here, and we are almost done. So all we need now is that button in the end. And so, as I showed you before, for that we can simply use the button element in HTML. So add to cart, and of course that button, so clicking that button will not do anything. For that we would need some JavaScript, but at least it is here visible. Okay, and we see here that we have 80 unsaved changes. So if you want to preserve those changes, again, you would have to save the CodePen and create a free account in order to do that. Oh, and I thought that we were actually done with this challenge, but there is one small piece missing. So this text here in the original is actually bold. So that's the only difference. So that's something that we're missing. And so let's simply wrap this value here, so all this text, into a strong element. Not string, strong. And you see, now at this point, we didn't close this tag, so the strong element. And so now all the rest of the content basically became strong. So everything is bold now because this element never ends. But of course, that would be a mistake. It wouldn't even be valid HTML, but the browsers somehow still are able to render it somehow. But anyway, with this, we finished this challenge and actually also the introduction to HTML section. So make sure to review everything that you just learned in this section, all your new skills. And then once you're ready, we can together move on to our next section, which will be the fundamentals of CSS. And so there you will finally learn how to actually style your content and make it look a little bit more polished and more beautiful. So that's really, really exciting. And so, yeah, once you're ready, let's move on there. See you soon.